listener production.
From the briefing team,
This is The Beefing. Hey, it's Helen Smith here. Welcome to The Beefing. Today's beef is on Steve Jobs versus Bill Gates. Let's get into it. Steve Jobs and Bill Gates share a lot of similarities. They were both college dropouts, both started their companies with a friend, and both went on to become the two most powerful figures in tech. But the pair also created one of the biggest rivalries in the tech world, the battle between Apple and Microsoft, with the two first meeting in the late 1970s. Now, both of these men have been controversial and have had colourful lives, but that's a story for another time. Today's beef is just focusing on the relationship between Gates and Jobs. So let's take it back to where it all began. Starting with Steve Jobs, a Buddhist and son of adoptive parents. He started Apple Computer with his friend Steve Wozniak, and in the late 1970s, they changed the world as we know it today with the introduction of home computers, selling the Apple I PC, and it was a hit. This was during the era where everyone was racing to get the best at-home computer on the market, and by 1978, just 2 years after the release, Jobs was worth over $1 million at just 23 years old, equivalent to nearly $5 million in 2025. And then by 25 years old, his net worth grew to an estimated $250 million. That's about $1.3 billion today. That's a lot of money for someone who's not even 30. Now, while this is going on, Bill Gates drops out of Harvard and co-founds Microsoft, which was formerly Microsoft with a space. And he did it with Paul Allen in 1975. And Gates becomes the president of Microsoft, which he holds from 1977 to 1982. Now, in 1980, Bill Gates develops MS-DOS, a Microsoft operating system for personal computers. And just 4 years later, he sold 2 million copies. And by the early 1990s, more than 100 million copies are sold. Now, Microsoft and Apple were actually collaborators back in the day. Microsoft made the software for Apple's Apple II PC. And during the early 80s, Jobs flew up to Gates to sell him on the possibility of making Microsoft software for the Apple Macintosh computer and its revolutionary graphical user interface. But Gates wasn't on board, later saying this: "It was a kind of weird seduction visit where Steve was saying, we don't really need you and we're doing this great thing and it's under the cover." He's in his Steve Jobs sales mode, but kind of the sales mode that also says, I don't need you, but I might let you be involved. But Steve Jobs powers ahead without Gates, and in 1980, Apple goes public. And though their relationship seemed rocky, Gates still appeared alongside Jobs in a video in 1983, a dating game riff, which was actually screened for Apple employees ahead of the Macintosh's launch.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, the Macintosh software dating game.
Welcome to the Macintosh software dating game. Software CEOs, could I please ask you to introduce yourselves?
My name is Bill Gates. I'm chairman of Microsoft. And during 1984, Microsoft expects to get half of its revenues from Macintosh software.
Then, in 1984, Jobs introduces the Macintosh computer. And for a while there, the pair and their companies worked well together. That was until Gates introduced the Microsoft Windows operating system to compete with Apple, and Jobs was not happy. He actually accused Gates of ripping off the Apple Macintosh, but Gates didn't care, saying if Jobs really believes that, he's entered into one of his own reality distortion fields, and that he didn't think Apple had the exclusive rights to the idea, because he says that he knows Apple took the idea for the graphical interface from Xerox PARC Labs, a research institution they both admired and Jobs visited back in late 1979.
I had 3 or 4 people who kept bugging me that I ought to get my rear over to Xerox PARC and see what they were doing. And so I finally did. I went over there, and they were very kind, and they showed me what they were working on. And they showed me really three things. But I was so blinded by the first one that I didn't even really see the other two. I was so blinded by the first thing they showed me, which was the graphical user interface. I thought it was the best thing I had ever seen in my life. Now, remember, it was very flawed. What we saw was incomplete. They'd done a bunch of things wrong, but we didn't know that at the time. It's still, though, they had the germ of the idea was there, and they'd done it very well. And within, 10 minutes, it was obvious to me that all computers would work like this someday.
Gates also said that he thinks there's more than one way of looking at it. He said, "I think it's more like we both had this rich neighbor named Xerox, and I broke into his house to steal the TV set and found out that you, being Jobs, had already stolen it." But while this tiff was going on, Jobs was allegedly fired from his position at Apple and quits the company entirely. But he eventually returns over 10 years later, but we'll get into that in a sec. Now, while Jobs is out of Apple, Gates continues to push forward at Microsoft, and it's looking pretty good. Gates starts developing and promoting CD-ROM technology, and by 1987, he becomes the youngest US billionaire, worth $1.25 billion at 31 years old. So, while Bill Gates is building his tech empire, Steve Jobs was out of the top job at Apple, and he founded Nex Inc., which would eventually lead him back to Apple. He also founded during this time the graphics group, later renamed Pixar, from Lucasfilm's Computers Graphics division. And the first film produced by the graphics group, or Pixar, was in partnership with Disney. And it was none other than Toy Story, with Jobs credited as executive producer. And this venture would eventually see him become one of the largest single shareholders in Disney after it purchased Pixar. But that's a story for another time. Now, while this was all happening, Jobs was also planning his return to Apple, and he did in 1996. But it didn't come without a little pushback from Gates. Reportedly, when the then CEO of Apple, Gil Amelio, moved to buy Next, this is the company that Jobs founded when he left Apple, and bring Jobs back to Apple, Gates tried to talk him out of it, saying, "I know his technology and you'll never be able to make it work on your machines. Don't you understand that Steve doesn't know anything about technology? He's just a super salesman. I can't believe you're making such a stupid decision. He doesn't know anything about engineering, and 99% of what he says and thinks is wrong. What the hell are you buying that garbage for?" Yeah, pretty harsh. And in the same year, 1996, Jobs said in a PBS documentary called Triumph of the Nerds that Gates and Microsoft make third-rate products and that they just have no taste.
They have absolutely no taste. And what that means is, I don't mean that in a small way, I mean that in a big way, in the sense that they don't think of original ideas and they don't bring much culture into their product. I am saddened, not by Microsoft's success. I have no problem with their success. They've earned their success, for the most part. I have a problem with the fact that they just make really third-rate products. Their products have no spirit to them. Their products have no sort of spirit of enlightenment about them. They are very pedestrian.
And Jobs also said for years that Gates was too focused on business and kind of a bit boring. And ironically, during this time, Microsoft was at the top of its game in the 1990s, and Apple needed a $150 million investment from Microsoft to help keep them afloat. And in 1997, Jobs was back as Apple CEO, and during his first Macworld keynote, he announced that he had accepted the investment from Microsoft to help keep Apple from going under. And then Bill Gates appeared on a huge screen via satellite uplink, and boos erupted from the audience. And then in 1998, Jobs unveiled the iMac. So things were looking pretty good for Jobs. As for Gates, the Department of Justice were gunning for him. In 1998, the Department of Justice, 20 states, and the District of Columbia all filed lawsuits accusing Microsoft of using illegal, anti-competitive, and exclusionary practices. Now, these lawsuits go on for years, and during that time, in 2000, Gates resigns as CEO of Microsoft and becomes Chief Software Architect. And in the years that follow, Apple was continuing to release new products like the iPod, and iTunes. And then in 2007, the iPhone, which changed the world as we know it.
A widescreen iPod with touch controls, a revolutionary mobile phone, and a breakthrough internet communications device. These are not 3 separate devices. This is one device. And we are calling it iPhone. Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone.
And Gates actually praised Jobs, but he also sent a few internal memos to Microsoft saying Microsoft need to do more. So while there was a little bit of praise, pretty much when either of the two released new tech, they kind of slammed each other. But then in 2006, Gates announces he will be giving up his daily role at Microsoft, effective July 2008, to concentrate on his humanitarian and educational interests. And Jobs was brutal when Gates left Microsoft, saying, "Bill is basically unimaginative and has never invented anything. Ouch." Then in 2007, the pair made a rare appearance together at the All Things Digital conference, where they seemed to actually have a few nice things to say.
The biggest thing was Bill was really focused on software before almost anybody else had a clue that it was really the software.
Bill, how about the contribution of Steve and Apple?
Well, first I want to clarify, I'm not fake Steve Jobs.
You know, I think of most things in life as either a Bob Dylan or a Beatles song. But there's that one line in that one Beatles song, you and I have memories longer than the road that stretches out ahead. And that's clearly true here.
So it seemed like the feud had started to simmer down between the two. But then in 2011, Jobs stands aside as CEO in August and sadly later passes away that same year after battling cancer. And in 2013, Gates gave an interview where he talked about spending time with Jobs when he got sick.
When he was sick, I got to go down and spend time with him.
And talked about what?
Oh, about what we'd learned, about families, anything.
Must have been tough. He's a guy
No,
you've
he
lived.
was not being melancholy like, I've been chipped. It was very, forward-looking about, we haven't really improved education with technology yet. What do you think? Or, he showed me the boat he was working on and talked about how he's looking forward to being on it, even though, we both knew there was a good chance that wouldn't happen.
He knew that, but he went on ahead to build a boat.
Sure. Thinking about your potential mortality isn't very constructive.
And since then, Gates has continued his work, donating to everything from women's health to fighting AIDS. And he's been back in the headlines recently for some controversial comments on climate change. But that's for another day. So that's where the beef between Gates and Jobs ends. Apple is one of the most valuable companies in the world, and Gates is still one of the richest men in the world. But that's it for today's beefing on Steve Jobs versus Bill Gates. If you like this ep, we'd love you to share it with someone else who you think might enjoy it as well. And if you have any beefs that you want us to cover, send them our way. You can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast and on YouTube. Until then, I'm Helen Smith. Catch you next time.